Hi friends, today I want to talk to you about all the books that I read in August. I had a great reading month. I very much tried to prioritize making more time for reading at the beginning of the month, and it really paid off. I was able to read quite a few things very early on, and that ended up being very helpful because then later in the month I got pretty busy, and then some life things happened, and that's why I haven't posted a video in a little bit. But I'm back at it now, and I really want to talk to you about all the books I've been reading. So the first book that I picked for the month was As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner for Faulkner in August. So this was a readathon, and so I was part of a group chat while I was reading this, and it was very active, very lively, and it was very fun to see what everybody was thinking, different people's interpretations of this as we were going. But yes, so this follows a family, the Bundren family, and at the beginning of the story, the matriarch of the family is dying, and so we get to see the family kind of preparing for that and dealing with that. And then once she has died, it becomes all about transporting her remains to her hometown, because that was one of her dying wishes, to be buried with her people. And they encounter quite a few obstacles along the way. We really get to kind of meet each character and get to know them and their motivations. So the chapters are short chapters that take the perspective of different characters for each one. So we follow the different family members, but then also some community members. And we get to know each of them as we just kind of hear from their point of view, and also their thoughts on each other, their perceptions of each other. And I love that kind of thing so much. Slowly piecing things together like that, I find a lot of fun. Just very interesting. But the writing in this is very interesting. So it's in the stream of consciousness style, particularly opaque at times. It gives you some things that are concrete facts, and you come to understand those as you read. And then others are just sort of gaps that you bring your own experience and interpretation to fill those gaps and make sense of other things. The characters don't fully let you in on everything about themselves. And there's something very interesting about that. I personally really enjoyed that. But the writing is also very succinct and descriptive, very beautiful at times, other times very harrowing and cinematic. But it also has a lot of irony and dark humor. And it was interesting because so much of it is kind of personal interpretation. And so in the group chat, some people did not pick up on any kind of humor. They read it very kind of straightforward. And so, you know, that's kind of part of the interesting thing about a book like this. So yes, I ended up really enjoying this. I very much enjoyed the piecing together an understanding of the characters, getting to know them, their background and their setting, the family dynamics, their individual motivations, and seeing what happened to everybody. And I also do think it's a great one to read in a book, like I said, because you get to hear how other people are thinking about it, and piecing things together, and it's very fun in that way. So yeah. The next book I want to talk about is the first audiobook I listened to this month, and it was Unspeakable, The Story of Junius Wilson by Susan Burch and Hannah Joyner. That's Hannah from Hannah's Books. And I actually accidentally binged through this book because I could just not stop listening to it. I just was very immersed in it. This is actually nonfiction, and it follows the life of Junius Wilson, who was a deaf black man who was wrongly accused of attempted rape. And he was deemed insane and placed into a state mental hospital. And eventually the charges were dropped, but by that point he was already in the mental hospital. And he was never actually diagnosed as insane or mentally ill in any way. He was simply deaf and he knew a certain kind of sign language, but nobody around him knew that, and they didn't try to find a way to communicate with him, and so he was basically stuck in the mental institution for the vast majority of his life, 60 plus years. And so this very much focuses on his individual life story and the things that happened to him, but it's also a way to highlight greater issues and get this broader image of kinds of slow progress and activism that brought about changes for the better, that affected Junius for the better over time. And so you get to learn about different kinds of activism and changing laws relating to racism, poverty, and disability, and how those really also impacted the public attitude towards these different things. And there was also a big focus on Junius's deafness and how he really missed out a lot in his life by not being provided access to a community and a means of communication. So it's a frustrating story, but it's also a really important reminder that systemic injustice still permeates the system, and that, you know, we should look for these things and keep improving things, because it's definitely not gone. So this really kind of set the tone for a lot of the other stuff I ended up reading this month. So a lot of it ended up feeling like it was in conversation, and that's a really cool thing when, you know, when that ends up happening. And so I ended up reading about a lot of Black experiences, some from Black voices, and also, you know, with themes dealing with racism and the legacy of slavery as well. And so the next book that I read was Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward. And this one was actually a recommendation from Hannah, from Hannah's Books, to read alongside As I Lay Dying, because it is inspired by As I Lay Dying, and also by Beloved by Toni Morrison, which I also ended up reading, but I read this one first. So this one follows a dysfunctional family in Mississippi I think it might be in the 2010s. And so we start out from the perspective of Jojo, who is a young teen, maybe 13 years old, 13, 14. And so the chapters skip between his point of view and Leonie, who is his mother. I think it's every other chapter. And then he also has a little sister who is 3 years old. And the two of them are being raised actually by their grandparents. And where the story starts, the grandmother is actually dying from cancer. And the story really takes off when Leonie gets a call that the children's father, Michael, is being released from prison. Leonie and her parents are Black, and Michael is white, so the children are mixed. And she wants to take the children along with a friend on a road trip to go pick up Michael from prison. And then another important detail is that Leonie's brother, Given, died when he was in high school, and she sees his ghost when she is high. She has an addiction problem, and that's another important detail. And so this very much ends up being about getting to know the different family members and their different family dynamics, their relationships, the ways that they are not always there for each other, they fail each other. Jojo and his little sister have a really beautiful relationship. It was very heartwarming, and really countered a lot of the very difficult moments in this. And this also very much explores prison's legacy of slavery and also generational trauma. But yeah, my favorite part, the thing that stood out to me a lot, was definitely the complex family dynamics and relationships. That was my favorite to get to learn about in this. And you also have lots of secrets and ghosts. One thing I found interesting is that for the blurbs for this, it's often described as very lyrical, and I don't know, maybe it's because I'm comparing it to some of the other things I read, but to me the writing was more on the straightforward side, which is not a bad thing, just different, I guess, than I interpreted that. But I ended up really enjoying this. I actually had a really good time reading it, but I am glad that I read it before I read Beloved, because Beloved by Toni Morrison is probably one of the best books I've ever read. The scope of what this is exploring, and the level of mastery that it has in trying to do that is very just amazing. So this starts out with a mother and a daughter. You have Setha, who escaped slavery, and Denver, her daughter, who was born during Setha's escape from slavery. And so Denver has never been enslaved. She doesn't like to hear about her mother's life before she was born. But there's another presence in their home, an unhappy ghost, that makes its presence known by doing things like leaving handprints on a cake or shattering a mirror, things like that. And so we learn that before this point, Setha's older boys have actually run away from home when they were in their early teens. And then also Setha's mother-in-law, baby Suggs, used to live with them, but she has been dead for quite a few years at this point. And so this really takes off when Paul D., who was also an enslaved man at Sweet Home, appears one day. They have not seen each other since they escaped. And yeah, this is where the story really takes off. And so we get to see the characters as their life progresses from this point on, but more and more they very reluctantly start to remember things from their past, and it starts to really affect their present, especially when Paul D drives out the ghost from Setha's home, and then very soon after a very mysterious young woman appears, calling herself Beloved. So I feel like it's very hard to talk about this book because it's hard to do it justice, but it's very much about the individual characters. They're very fully realized, very distinct people with motivations and a very strong voice and personality. But it is also a great story about the legacy of slavery and how the burden of it falls so heavily on Black individuals. And then this is also an elegy for the many millions of enslaved people who died under slavery. And the writing in this is just so beautiful and harrowing. It feels very intentional and very layered. And it's got this wonderful mix of sounding like speech, but also so poetic without using like very complicated language or like big words. There is a kind of lyricism to it in a kind of rhythm or cadence. And then it also very selectively has moments where things are quite abstract, sort of dreamlike, and it creates this very sensory kind of experience, but that's done very selectively, and I think that works so well. And so I do want to read a really quick quote from the intro where Toni Morrison is talking about her intent. In trying to make the slave experience intimate, I hope the sense of things being both under control and out of control would be persuasive throughout, that the order and quietude of everyday life would be violently disrupted by the chaos of the needy dead, that the Herculean effort to forget would be threatened by memory desperate to stay alive. To render enslavement as a personal experience, language must get out of the way. And I really do think that she manages to bend language in her favor. I do think that this requires, some imagination and some suspension of disbelief. We've got kind of literal ghosts in this and some kind of supernatural things happening at times. But if you can manage that, I feel like for me it was just a very deeply emotional experience, which is what I didn't manage to do the first time that I tried reading this, because this is a reread for me. I actually read it initially in 2020, and I kind of really struggled with it because I had this idea that I should be able to have like specific metaphors or read it like an allegory or something like that, where I think the reality of this is that it's talking about a much messier kind of reality, and it has a lot more than one point or one message to make. But so in that initial experience, I really just kind of struggled against it. I just wasn't willing to let it be what it wanted to be, and wasn't open to the kind of experience that it can give. But so I'm so glad that I picked it up again, because I ended up loving it so much. And it's great to see how much I have grown and changed as a reader. And I'm also so excited to get to more of her books. Now the hard part is going to be picking what I'll try next. But yeah, so I'm a really big fan. I do highly recommend. It's a tough read, but I just couldn't put it down. I thought it was so worthwhile. Highly recommend if you haven't read it yet. The next book I want to talk about is another audiobook, and it is James by Percival Everett. I definitely picked this up because of all the hype, but this is a retelling of Huckleberry Finn, except it is from the point of view of James, or Jim. And the perspective change really kind of creates this role reversal and makes the adventure story become a kind of hero's journey for James. At the beginning of the story, James finds out that he is going to be sold, and so he runs away. And as he is trying to figure out what to do, he runs into Huckleberry Finn, who is also kind of running away. And so they decide to kind of join forces and figure it out together. And they run into all kinds of misadventure. So I do want to talk about some kind of specific plot things that happen. I'm not going to talk about any big reveals or anything like that, but I am going to timestamp where you can jump to if you are trying to avoid any kind of plot spoilers. But anyway, so this is your warning. So I forget exactly when, but at some point James finds out that his wife and daughter are going to be sold as well. And so it very much becomes a story of him figuring out how to save them. There are also some important devices that the story uses that are different from the original Huckleberry Finn. So the first one is that James purposely uses slave speech to manipulate and defend himself against white people. And he also teaches this to other enslaved people around him that he knows. And then James will also have these dream sequences where he debates important Western philosophers on their kind of questionable, tepid ideas about slavery and freedom and equality and things like that. And so even though James is very eloquent and will have these kind of ruminations on slavery and racism and things like that, he doesn't really let the reader in to get to know him more personally. I very much felt like that wasn't really what the book was concerned with. It was not very concerned with psychology, a lot more kind of philosophy. And you don't really get to know most of the other characters very well either. You never get to know any of his family members or a lot of the other people that he meets very much, because the story is quite plot heavy and you move very episodically from one thing to the next, very much mimicking the original Huckleberry Finn. And so it feels to me like this is a lot less of a very personal story of James and a lot more about his intellectual journey. He meets a lot of Black people on his journey, and they all sort of represent different points of view or stances. For example, there's one person who sides with his overseer. He's very much concerned with just looking out for himself and defending himself, and so he doesn't care about any of the other enslaved people and will kind of throw them under the bus to keep himself safe. And then you have others who are a lot more willing to help other enslaved people, even if it gets them into trouble. And I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's almost like a checklist of points of view. And I felt like that was a very interesting thing to be able to discuss maybe in a school setting or like a book club setting. But all of these things definitely end up informing James's intellectual journey throughout the story. And so two big things that I noticed is how plot heavy it was, very much episodic, mimicking the original, and also very much interested in ideas, these philosophical ideas to do with slavery, racism, colorism, equality, things like that. But it touches on a lot of those, but I didn't really feel like it delved too deeply into any of them. And it also doesn't delve too deeply into the characters beyond their opinions to do with these different themes. And so this book very much feels to me like a response to things like the original Huckleberry Finn, which are well-intentioned, but part of the very slow-moving progress that is just so coddling and accommodating to the white people whose minds it's trying to change. So I noticed some very interesting things that this book was trying to do, but I can't say that my personal reading experience was as enjoyable as it seems to be for a lot of other people. I've just enjoyed personally a lot of the other things that I have read this month relating to similar topics more, and so I would personally recommend those more. But this is definitely not a bad book, just not a personal favorite. And the last book I have to talk to you about is How to Read Literature Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster. And so I picked this up because I really enjoy reading critically, but I've never learned from an organized source. And so I thought it might be cool to read something that is specifically about that teaches you, how to do that, I guess. And so the aim of this book specifically is to increase your enjoyment of what you're reading by teaching you to look for symbols, patterns, and intertextuality in what you are reading. So each chapter focuses on a different subject. For example, the first one is quests and how many stories are quests, though usually quests are not for the initial thing that you think they're a quest for. For example, another one focuses on rain and different kind of uses of rain in the story and how those can symbolize things like cleansing or rebirth and things like that. And it isn't trying to provide like an exhaustive list of ways to interpret things. It's meant to encourage you to use your imagination to come up with more ways to interpret different things and find symbols, look for symbols. And also intertextuality. So it talks about how many stories reference characters and stories from classics like Shakespeare, Homer, the Greek myths, the Bible, those kinds of things. And picking up on those is a way to take a story that is about a specific thing and give you a sort of broader context for the things that are being discussed in the story. So I was very happy to find that a lot of the things that this talked about were not entirely new to me, but I was definitely very happy to brush up on a lot of the stuff because I feel like I'm a very kind of intuitive reader when it comes to interpreting things, and thinking about things in a more conscious level is kind of nice and a positive kind of change that can add more to my reading experience. So I enjoyed this quite a bit. I think that it's a great starting point. One thing that the author mentions in the intro is the idea of how this is meant to be a way to give you a starting point from which you can then go on your own journey and find your own personal ways of interpreting things and adding that personal touch to the way that you interpret the things that you are reading, which I really appreciate. I think that especially if you are pretty new to the idea of reading critically, this is a great starting point, and I would definitely recommend it. And this also reminded me that I'm becoming very interested in reading more like literary criticism and theory, stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to adding more of that kind of reading into my reading for the rest of the year. But that's all the books. That's all I had to share with you. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any thoughts on any of the things I read, or if you want to tell me about some of the stuff that you read this month or last month, do let me know. And thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.
A wild Bowie has appeared. Say hi. Hi.